we're going to get started. So thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing Kirsten. So she's currently a student here at the University of Kansas. She's in the final stages of her MFA, which for those from the science background, the MFA is a terminal degree in the arts. And so this is, it's a pleasure to have you here to share your work with us. So Kirsten, she has a BA in studio arts from Baylor University, and then she also did some post-baccalaureate work at the Utah State University, where she worked with ceramics for 2 years, and then she's had many exhibitions nationally at venues in Indianapolis, Starbuck Gallery, and the Lady Volkus Art Center. She's been awarded commissions at the Spencer here on campus for 2 years. She received I think the first artist in residency at Johnson County Parks and Rec, which is really awesome. She just did that residency last year in the fall. She just had her show at the end of last month, entitled AFIELD, which was an amazing show. So if you guys missed that, I think you get to see like a substitute, but if you ever get a chance to see her work in person, definitely check it out. It is incredible. She's a multimedia artist based here in the Tallgrass Prairie, and she studies these relationships between humans and nature. And I want to take a moment and share some words that my friend Joey Orr has been teaching me, and those are the differences between sort of artistic research, which is often articulated as practice-led research. And that means that this process, the artistic practice is leading with, instead of leading with a theory or some type of question to be tested, that research is often led by the artistic practice and can lead to questions later. And so that's a little bit reversed in how we sort of approach research in the sciences, where we often have that question in mind first and start there and then investigate it using very rigorous approaches. But I think that it's important that we all sort of acknowledge how much value there is to view things from both angles, and how important it is, how much we can learn from being together in this super interdisciplinary community. And that's, I mean, when we talk about accessibility, that is one of the key things. And so that reach is incredible. So with that, please join me in first congratulating Kirsten for making it to the final stages. So excited for you. And then also welcoming her to our seminar for today.
Thank you, Sheena, for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone here in person and on Zoom for joining me today. So I'm gonna do the Zoom thing where I say, I'm gonna share my screen. Give me a second. Yeah, it's like taking a second to update. Oh no, there might be difficulties. Okay. All right. Excellent. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess I did need a second. So anyway, so sorry. So I'm here to talk to everyone today about the arts research that I've been conducting at the KU Field Station. And so I'll talk about my practice as it relates to that body of work, which was also the work for my thesis show. And so learning from place is what I'm calling this presentation, because that's sort of the angle that I'm coming at for this particular presentation. And I just want to share a little bit, with artists, we always really like to talk about, where we started, where we came from. It can be really important to our story. And so just to like give you a frame of where I came from, this is a bird's eye view of my parents' property in North Texas. And it's about 10 acres of land. And this area I discovered later would have been the Blackland Prairie. And so I grew up in the country, and there weren't really any, like you can see, there's not any houses super close to us. There were even less houses when I was a kid than there are now. And so I didn't go over to friends' houses in the summer. I was like running around this property and, just finding things and making little trails through the cedar trees here. So these are two photos. The one on the left is of my parents' property in North Texas, and the one on the right is actually from the field station. And so when I got to Kansas, as I lived elsewhere and moved here for graduate school, the landscape was really familiar in a lot of ways, these kind of grassy areas with cedar trees, and the plants were different but related. I'm pretty sure the plants, the grasses, the kind of reddish grasses that you see are in the left photo are a type of blue stem. And yeah, Kelly signs on to that. So there are like, related and similar plants that are just slightly different. So there was a lot of things that were very familiar. And as for my arts practice in grad school, over the course of the 3 years, I've been really focusing on our connection with nature, our relationship with the natural world, and really trying to reframe hierarchies that place humans above nature and really prioritize our needs in the way that we organize society. So I do that by demonstrating the ways that our lives are entangled with other more than human lives. And so texts that I was reading throughout this time were Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown, Plants as Persons, Second Nature, A Gardener's Education, and Being Ecological, which is a philosophical text by Timothy Morton. So all of these were feeding into my practice. And then I came across, just over a year ago, Soren Larson and Jay Johnson's Being Together in Place, Indigenous Coexistence in a More Than Human World. And I was really struck by this idea of coexistence. It was already something I was obviously talking about, but I hadn't quite placed that, those words, that phrase onto it yet. And I really loved this quote, knowing the world begins with place, with our embodied experience of all that place entails, including human and non-human others. So I really took this text and this idea of learning from place to be the framework for my thesis show, which by the time I encountered it, I was already looking ahead to. And so I knew that that's what I wanted to work with. And I chose the KU field station as my place to learn from, partially because I had been visiting the KU field station basically since I arrived, which I know a lot of people in the biological survey were like, how did you even know about the field station? Well, I was recommended by a friend, Brandy Lee Cooper. She recommended that we go there, that it was like this great place that people didn't know, not enough people knew about. So we would go there for walks all the time. And I was also choosing it because it has this history, both as like a post-agricultural site, and then also this long history as a place of research with the longstanding prairie research project that's gone on there. And so then I got to meet Sheena Parsons, and she told me like how to go about actually being a researcher at the field station. And so I was able to apply. I'm pretty sure I started that process in May of last year. And so how to learn from a place, it's kind of a different way of thinking about things. And, especially for other people who have been to school and college, you're used to getting assignments and course objectives, and this didn't have any. So So I was choosing embodied learning as my framework for how I would go about learning from place. And that's really just a fancy way of saying that I was going to use my senses and pay attention and do a lot of listening, both to place and myself, in order to learn and navigate through this space. And as an artist, that is, as Sheena was talking about and alluded to with her introduction, it really is the way that artists naturally approach things, where because you're interacting with materials and having to pay attention to materials and process, you have to use your senses to figure out what you need to do or how to fix things that go wrong. And this was a little bit different because I found that I really had to go to the field station without an agenda. If I knew what I was going to do, or I had like a plan, which as a grad student, it was hard not to feel like I wanted to have a plan for what I was going to do with my time. But if I did, it would really distract me from being present in place, which is something that I will talk about as I go along too. So one of the things, activities that I did do other than being in place and listening, was I did a lot of gathering of different materials. I didn't always know exactly how I would use them. In the case of the plants that you see in this photograph, these are dye plants. So I knew that I could use them to make natural dyes, but I might not have had a really specific idea of like what project I was going to dye, what it was going to be used for exactly. But this process of gathering materials, it really demanded that I learn more about the plants and other like animals and things that were around me. If I was going to gather dye plants, I needed to understand which ones would be good for dyeing. And then I also did a lot of processing as well, where I was processing different materials, sometimes in the case of the dye materials, but also sourcing clay from place too. And that again increased my time with these materials from place and with place itself. You have to understand a little bit of geology in order to find clay, and also then working with the clay and seeing its properties tells you a little bit about the place and its geological history too. So, and I do want to be clear, a lot of these, there can be some romanticism about collecting materials from place, and there is sort of like, this romantic part to it, but it also, it still creates an impact on the environment. And so I don't want to say that it doesn't do things like that, but those impacts were not removed from me. For instance, when you dye with natural dyes, it still takes a lot of water for that process. But I was acutely aware of how much water I was having to use instead of it being removed from me in another country. So I think that that's like an important thing that I learned through the process as well. I also did a lot of writing about being in the field station, which often took the form of poems. But again, I really found that I couldn't write at the field station because then I was paying attention to writing and I wasn't paying attention to the place. So I learned that I needed to separate those two things. And I also bring that up because it's probably really different than scientific researchers in the field who are probably taking copious amounts of notes so that they can remember all of the little details. And since I was not trying to remember things in that way, I was able to kind of be immersed in the experience of being there and then reflecting on it later. And it also kept me from bringing any expectations to the field station as well of like what I should see. And so I think that's something that when Sheena was talking about the importance of doing this kind of research as well, or somebody doing this kind of research, even if you're not that kind of person, is that, we might see things that we weren't looking to see because we didn't bring any sort of theory or idea to the place. And I also want to take an opportunity to talk about just all the human collaborators that I had as well, because the field station being an active research site, there was a lot of other research going on that I was made aware of. Also the other artist who's working out at the field station, Janine Antoni, and one of her events brought together quite a few field station experts, I guess you could say, or people who had their various areas of expertise, and talked a little bit about it. And that was a very meaningful event for me as well, because it introduced me to people that I hadn't known before. And then the residency that I did in Shawnee Mission Park, even though it was not at the field station, I was working closely with the natural resources team for Johnson County Park and Recreation District. And it was interesting to see how they thought about conservation and saw their role in the parks, and that there was some tension there between, park people who are the other areas in the park and themselves. But then also just like how they conceived of the importance of their role in the park. And then also Kelly Kincher has been a big help. I took a class with him spring of my first year here. So he definitely was part of leading me down this road. And then Mary Ann Jordan taught me all that I know about natural dyes. And so that was also invaluable. And a fellow grad student, Ann Rogers, has a lot of background paper making. And so you'll see that I made some paper with prairie plants, and their input on that was very important. So as an arts researcher, my arts research culminates always in some sort of body of work. And in this case, as part of the MFA program, it's a requirement as well as a pleasure to put together a thesis show. And so my thesis show was all about the research that I did at the field station. It was titled AFIELD, both to reference the name field station, but then also this idea of being far afield is straying from an original point or perspective. And I felt like that was reflective of what I was trying to do with my learning from place out at the field station. Was I was trying to stray and see where it took me. And so this is just another image of the thesis show. So this is, you can see the pieces in their entirety, how they were in the gallery. And then I just want to talk a little bit about some of the pieces in the show. So the first piece that really came together was this book, which is a handmade book titled AFIELD, Poems from the Tallgrass. And so this contained a lot of the poems that I talked about that I was writing while I was there, which were really me reflecting on what it was like to be in the field station, and also what it was like to try to do this learning from place. And in large part, most of the inks are made from plants that were harvested in the field station, and the paper is partially prairie grass with some other fibers as well. And those I made myself too. So I was really trying to imbue this particular work with kind of that care and intimacy that comes from knowing a place really well. And it sort of harkens back in some ways, I feel, to my childhood and knowing a place really well when I was a kid, and then trying to do that in a new place. And you can see here in this slide of this page of the book, I also took some xylene transfers that were copied from a book about, it was actually the Henry S. Fitch Reservation. It was this little pamphlet that Sheena gave me that gave more information about like that initial stages of the field station and that first gift, I think, of land to the university. So I was able to use some transfers from that book. And they had poems, but also drawings as well, ink drawings of, different things I was seeing out in the field station. And just included some notes here at the end that talked more about the project and how it got started. And so this piece really was, like I said, it was a love letter. It was handwritten, just like my original poems were. So that's why I chose to do it in this way, so that it would really reflect back to my time and what it was like to be in the field station and do this work. And then I also, one of the themes of the show is also time. And it kind of crops up in several ways, because I think whenever you're returning to a space over and over again, time becomes really apparent in a lot of different ways. But also, you know, most people visiting like something like the field station, they might only do it once every few months or something like that if they're not a researcher there. And so they really miss a lot of the subtle shifts that happen. So this piece, Shades of Grass, is prairie grass that was harvested at several different points in the season, from about late July to early October. And once I was collecting those, not really knowing what I was going to do with them, but I noticed that they had these subtle shifts in color, kind of moved from green to like reddish purples to golden yellows. And so I chose to weave these grasses together in a linear fashion, so that they also shift in color, which is more apparent in person. And then also the texture of the seed heads and the height is also changing as well. And so it really spoke to this intimacy of noticing those shifts only because you're returning so often. And in the gallery itself, you know, the warp, this is a detail of it so that you can see the warp is really quite delicate. So there's a lot of spaces through it, and the shadows on the wall were really important to how it was displayed, because that delicacy allowed for a lot of shadow play on the wall that really increased the kind of depth and richness and density of the piece. So another work that is also about noticing and kind of the subtlety that you get trained to recognize whenever you're visiting a place over and over again is this one, Goldenrod. And so this weaving is, I think, like 12 feet long, and it's dyed all with just goldenrod and with some overdying of indigo and a different mordant at the bottom. But it really is my homage to goldenrod solidago as a genus, because I first met Solidago canadensis, and I thought that was the goldenrod in the area. But then, especially with last year's dry fall, I really started to notice there were so many other kinds of goldenrod. And so the variations in yellow in this weaving actually come from the use of different fibers. So silk, cotton, linen, hemp, wool, and all of those take the same dye differently. And so you get these differences in color. And then, you know, as visually, I wanted to really reference like a beam of light falling on the landscape, and, you know, with the shift from yellow to green, a sort of horizon line. And so that piece was really about how you can start to notice more subtle differences once you really are paying attention. And I did a lot of steam bending of wood that was sourced from a local place here in town in Lawrence. And I really feel like the wood in a lot of places is sort of the stand-in for my touch, because I spent a lot of time touching all of these materials. And so in a lot of instances, the wood is sort of embracing or cradling the other materials in the work. And so this is a piece of honey locust. And then the white that you see is a piece of goldenrod that was dipped in porcelain and then fired. And so it leaves kind of the shell of the goldenrod behind. Another piece that used natural dyes as a way to talk about landscape and plants is this map of reciprocity. So it's a map of Lawrence, not to scale necessarily, but it uses a lot of silk organza and another silk that are dyed all with plants that are from here in Lawrence that I was given by people. So in some cases they were strangers, and I was coming to their house and just saying, hey, do you have any of these plants in your yard? Could I have a few of them? Or, could I have a few of the berries from your pokeberry? And, it was really like nerve-wracking to ask strangers for something like that. But they honestly met my interest with mostly a lot of curiosity and surprise and generosity as well. There were people who didn't have anything in their yard, but they would be like, well, come back here and look. And they would make me look at all of their plants to see if they had anything, because they just really wanted to help. But then I was also getting help from animals as well. Birds were the ones who were planting the pokeberries. None of these homeowners really wanted those around. So it kind of felt like this was a collaboration with the community, both plants, animals, and human animals as well. And so this map stands in for that kind of learning, that's part of coexistence as well, helping others around you and hopefully being generous when you can. This piece, glacial drift, is actually I use a CNC router to carve this really high density foam with the topographical landscape of the field station, and then use those pieces of high density foam to cast press mold clay from them. So these clay tiles, and this piece is about 6 feet by roughly 4 feet wide. And it stands, I think, 24 inches at the tallest. The kind of tiles in the back are the highest ones. And so this piece is also, again, about time and how, the landscape, especially at the field station, which hasn't been developed and covered over by concrete and other things like that, we can still see some of the history of this area. And so the title is really a reference to how this part of Northeast Kansas is referred to as the glaciated region, because there are still subtle hints that there were glaciers here. And I also wanted to challenge this idea of Kansas being, a really flat landscape that's featureless. There's nothing interesting about it. But seen at this scale from like a bird's eye view, you can really see that there's a lot more going on than you might have guessed. And also this references, again, my time as a kid growing up in my parents' place. I would make like these crude little maps, where bird's eye view maps, where I was trying to, mark where different things were on their property. There was like this one cactus that would bloom with those yellow flowers. And so I was like trying to figure out where it was so I could always get back to it, so I could visit it and see when it was blooming. And so it was always something that I did. Maps were another theme of the show, but it's something that I've always done to try to place myself in the landscape, and a way of like understanding how I'm moving through the landscape as well. So that's what this piece is also about, and is also, it's about time, because this clay is in part clay from the KU field station, and so that like also references the geological time of the area, references the earth. And then the catalpa with its tree rings references this more recent history of prairie becoming forest. This piece, Prairie Archive, also has time included in it, but it's really thinking about the future as well. These are all prairie plants that were dipped in porcelain again and then fired. And so through that firing transformation, the organic material gets burned away, and they become these sort of shells left behind that are empty in the middle, depending on what kind of plant it was. And so to me, these refer back to bones and bleached coral, and speak to kind of this loss. And it's also a question, maybe even relevant to some people who are listening today or in this room, of like, what do archives and scientific, data, what does it miss? And especially if any of these prairie plants go extinct, you know, what are we left with? How do we hold on to the knowledge that they gave us? And so these are sort of in reference to that archive, and that's why they're displayed sort of on this cushion in the way that you might see something displayed as an artifact in a natural history museum, just to evoke that question of, you know, how do we hold on to things when they're gone? Also about loss, this piece called Lingering Ash. So the clay, there's a wood piece to the left there, and then there's 3 clay pieces, and this is hung on the wall. And the clay are press molded from a bark mold that I made from bark that I got at the field station. So it was some ash bark that had delaminated from this tree. And then the piece of wood is also ash wood that was sourced locally as well. And lingering ash was a term that I came across as the way that some scientists are talking about the ash that will survive the emerald ash borer. And so this piece again is a question about like what the future holds as far as this particular genus, and the 3 pieces of bark refer to an ellipsis of, you know, we're not sure what's going to happen. And then looking back again in history, this piece called plat, which refers to plot or zoning. So a plat is a term used to talk about land being platted out or plotted out. And with this piece, the ceramic is Osage orange. So it was a mold taken from hedge apples. And then the wood itself is also Osage orange. And so in this piece, I'm really thinking about the history of settler colonialism and how land was divided, and how the Osage orange was part of that history, maybe unwillingly so, but you know, it was used to make these hedges that would keep cattle in, but then later it gets replaced with barbed wire, which maybe is worse. So, or maybe not, I'm not really sure. And so this is sort of like dealing with that history and thinking about how the land is so divided, and how that affects the plants and animals that are also sharing that space as well. And this last piece that I'll share with you is called Birth. And birth refers to like a shipping berth. So it's a place, it's an allocated place or a sleeping place. And this piece refers to all of the areas in the grass where I would see that deer had laid down to sleep or take a nap. And so I was thinking about the deer, and the paper, the handmade paper that's on the wall from prairie grass is a cast of deer prints made out at the field station. So I was thinking about deer populations, and that was something that actually the natural resources team at Shawnee Mission Park was really concerned with, and one of the things they were trying to figure out how to deal with, because the populations are getting so dense. The deer are trapped into smaller and smaller green spaces, but then disease can run rampant. And so this piece is really thinking about how do we make space for the other creatures who are sharing the landscape with us. And so this piece to me is really tender. You know, I've sculpted the deer hooves and then placed them on a bed of prairie grass. And the wood in this case is actually cedar, which is a favorite of the deer. So making a place for them, but also referencing this idea that death is part of the cycle, that often what conservation teams end up needing to do is create hunting programs that help them control the population of deer, since there are no longer any natural predators like wolves in the area to help them. And so that was a lot about different pieces, but going forward, I have a lot of questions and maybe even things that might be interesting for this audience to think about. But one of the things I'm wondering is how creative arts research complements or challenges, or how it can be used to spotlight scientific research or conceptions of nature. And then also questions for myself about if this mode of working, learning from place, like, is it promoting healing with the natural world? And can art do this? Or is learning from place promoting healing with the natural world? And can the art promote this kind of learning and healing? So, but thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor to talk to all of you. And yeah, I think we have time for questions. So if somebody, yeah. Yes, Kelly.
That was wonderful. It's just great to see your work, and I commend you on picking up botany in the process here too, and learning all these things. I'm going to kind of throw this back on you, but just your experience at the field station, where do you see opportunities for scientists to bring more art into their work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is just working with an artist, you know, more closely, because it was nice listening to like the natural resources team at Johnson County talk about their role, but it also would have been nice if I could have brought them into my studio for them to see like how I go about things, and kind of the nuances that I get to learn because I'm doing a more material-based research. So, I mean, it's a small thing, but for instance, I had this picture of the ink making that I was doing for the book. It's of course all the way back at the front. You know, so I was making this ink, and I used a natural dye process to make the ink. So something that's called making a lake, which basically just pulls the pigment out of the dye bath for you. And then I was using this glass muller to get the particle sizes smaller so it would flow better. And there's just like something magical about learning from a material, because like as I'm using the muller, you know, it's at first like a little bit gritty, and it's and I'm thinking like, do I need to add a little bit more water to this? But as I just keep going, it starts becoming more and more fluid, which is not a surprise to anybody who knows about like, I don't like rheology and those kinds of things, but it is always different to like really experience that information that you might know, like just as like factual information, but to see like how it really presents itself in the world is, I think, always like an interesting experience, even for people who understand. So yeah, I think like we have a lot of like artists like working alongside of researchers and looking at what they're doing. I think that's super valuable, but maybe like the missing half of the collaboration is to somehow bring those scientific researchers into an art studio to like see kind of how some of the things are coming about, or especially when it's like a material research, you know, and with the clay too, like noticing those differences between how this clay was to work with versus like commercial clays. You know, it's often a little bit more difficult to work with a clay that is not commercially made. It hasn't been mined and had all this stuff done to it, right? But so it tells you what its limitations are, and in that way forces you to collaborate with it. You have to like work with its limitations. So maybe some of those experiences would be also interesting for scientific researchers to see in a closer manner. Answer your question. Oh, sorry, we have a question in the room, but we also have one on Zoom. Okay.
Do you have any standout observations that you made while at the field station that were unexpected for you regarding landscape?
Unexpected. Maybe not specifically about the landscape, I think that one of the things that I walked away with that is a more, it like came about from observations at the field station, but is like a more general observation about, you know, about nature, is just this idea that, or this, what I think is true is that death is a requirement of living. And I think as like, especially Americans, we're really uncomfortable with death. And I think working outside, you have to get more comfortable with it. You know, like in the case with the deer, just realizing that, you know, a lot of people don't want hunting programs to be in place because they don't like the idea of deer getting killed, but deer are dying anyway when populations are at that density, but they're dying from things like disease or because they're getting hit by cars, you know. So death is a requirement, and we have to get more comfortable with the idea that sometimes, you know, because of the way that we're using the land, we're sort of choosing how animals are dying, either by our action or inaction. And that was something that the natural resources team was really aware of in their work. And they even told me that they sometimes feel like death dealers, that they're there to decide who dies. And maybe they're in this position where they're the only ones really having to face the fact that they're making those decisions because they're removed from other people. So I think working in place and working locally, you can't put that stuff off to somebody else. You sort of have to be either a part of, like in the case of processing materials, you have to be part of the negative impact that it can sometimes create, or you have to be a part of, you know, either choosing to promote native species or not, and letting invasive species take over. So that's kind of like a big takeaway, I think, for me, because it's an uncomfortable one. You know, it's one that we don't like to hear about.
So Helen Alexander has a question from Zoomland, and she says that she's curious how we can encourage more artists to do work at the field station.
Well, I mean, the main way is probably not going to be super helpful, but money is the main way that you can encourage artists, because artists are so underpaid. Like even when artists are getting a stipend, it's usually breaking down to be under minimum wage. And so that really is the best way to encourage, is because artists do need support. And you know, especially if it's something that they're having to travel to do, and it's not, you know, really far to the KU field station from the university, but it is still like this, you do have to like go out of your way to go there. And so it's removed from your studio. And so if you're traveling between the two, you know, that takes up time and that takes up resources to do that. And then even though, you know, I was using a lot of materials from the field station, I was still having to supplement it, especially for the display. I was still having to supplement it with like a lot of other materials in order to get it made. You know, I did end up buying the wood because that was appropriate for what I wanted to do. But, you know, I had to have hanging hardware, I had to have oil, I had to sand things, you know, the yarn was really expensive for the weaving. So even though an artist might be using forage materials, they almost always are going to have to use other materials, and they're not cheap. And then that's like before you even get to the actual labor and the time spent making work. So yeah, I think it's a perennial problem, because for whatever reason, arts doesn't take that place in our society where we want to pay for it. But that would definitely encourage artists to come and work at the field station. So, and also physically having a space for them too would be helpful as well. Yes.
So a lot of times when we're talking about our interaction with the natural world, you know, as you alluded to, it's so often is what can the world do for us, what the natural world can do for us. And a lot of times our historical look at it as focused on what did the Native Americans do with these products, and it's usually very utilitarian. And it seems like what you're doing isn't utilitarian. And I'm just wondering how that changes for you personally, how it changes your relationships. It's not me making something you're going to be using necessarily.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think some of it was what I alluded to before, where, you know, because I was using these materials, I had to like understand what the limitations of those materials were. So that was like one way of me getting to know them better, which obviously happens if you're making something utilitarian or not. I think like from the little that I know, some of the information that we're missing, I think from Indigenous people is also, you know, and maybe even rightly so, their ceremonies, that some of like how they interacted with the land and how they were like giving back to the land took place in those ceremonies. And so maybe that's something that because they understandably want to hold on to that information and keep it in their communities, that it's a part of the story that we're missing. But something that I've been thinking about, that there's kind of two ways forward if you're not part of an Indigenous community that already has sort of these ways of being that give back to the land or respect it in many ways. You probably have some sort of like plant worshipers in your history. So I've thought a lot about you know, pagan tribes in like Europe and Northern Europe, and sort of looked a little bit at like what we can tell about how they viewed the natural world and how they respected it. And then the other way forward is to like make up new ceremonies and find new ways to respect the natural world and to consider its needs. So I think it's like a combination for those of us in America, because these are new ecosystems that we have to figure out what they need and how, and we have to try to figure out how humans were a part of that. It probably is a lot in utilitarian ways, but maybe in a respectful utilitarian way, that you know, burning the prairie in order to cause new grass to come up, and then buffalo or bison come in and eat that new tender grass, and then it's easier to hunt. But obviously it also shaped this ecosystem. It shaped the biodiversity that we have in the tallgrass prairie region. So, you know, I think it also can be utilitarian, but have this benefit for an ecosystem as well. And so it's really just that there's never going to be a panacea. Like, you know, you have to like think about a local place. And so maybe just this practice of trying to learn from place and listen to it is the starting steps in figuring out like what those new ceremonies are and how we can like move forward in a way that that is about coexisting in, you know, coexisting is not just harmony, but it's like coexisting is just that all of the voices get heard, or there's not like one, you know, it's not a good coexistence if just one party always gets what they want and need. So yeah, that probably didn't answer your question exactly, but I think because we're at the beginning of like trying to figure this out, and it's going to take a lot of us to figure it out.
I don't know that I have a question, but, and maybe this, so thinking about, you had sort of those three basic questions at the end that you offered. And one of them sort of alluded to like how artists can help inform science. And I kind of feel like, you know, 100 years ago, there was like scientific like articles and things were so much more descriptive and flowery, and there were so many more observations, and just like that natural history component was there. And that is sort of missing from scientific literature right now.
Yeah.
Where so much is changing rapidly, like including how organisms are responding or like existing in the natural world. So to me, I guess this is like an acknowledgement
or like an expression of gratitude to the artist community, because I feel like those sort of reflections and observations that you have interpreting the natural world sort of are like filling this void of what used to be connected to science originally.
Yeah, I think that in the sciences there has been sort of almost a fear of imagination, and sometimes it's understandable. You want to be careful to not place your perspective on things, which is maybe even what was happening to a certain extent in the time period that you're talking about. But there are also moments where imagination, I think, is appropriate, because there are just some things that we can't know. Like, we can't really know what color Tyrannosaurus Rex's feathers were, or something like that, but so like, I think there are moments when it's worth it to imagine things, with the caveat that this is an imagination because we're trying to allude to the fact that we don't know everything, instead of pretending like we do and making like the shrink wrap Tyrannosaurus Rex like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, like with muscles and skin only, no fat, no like cartilage, no anything, right? So it's probably not any more true than an artist's imagining of like a Tyrannosaurus Rex with feathers and like, I don't know, like some like weird like sound waddle or something, like or like the Triceratops that has like maybe had like kind of like these nostril balloons or something. They don't know exactly. So it's a place where like artist imagination can like come in and help us like understand the limits, but also like the possibilities of our own knowledge, right? So, any more questions?
Comment really seems that the Hill Station should have an artist in residence program,
I think so.
and we need to figure out how to fund that. But that would be a
I've been talking,
great thing. Be a great thing.
that is one of the hopes and dreams that feels.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then figure out how to get scientists and people working here to pass through that, because you wouldn't want that just in isolation issue.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe like an example that I've learned a little bit more about recently was Bell Labs, and how, Bell Labs at the beginning of like computer science was bringing artists in to use like the computer equipment, and they were just like doing really weird things, and they were like working along like computer scientists and mathematicians and people who are working in a much different realm, and they're working side by side, and sometimes they just like look into somebody else's office and they're like, what are you doing? And like sometimes it was the artists who would like get this going, but also like, sometimes it was the researchers who were like, what are you doing with this? Like, what program, like, how are you programming this? And that was like an opportunity where just proximity and probably a culture of like sharing helped as well. And I don't know how it is in, scientific research, but depending on the artist, like sometimes there's like can be a little bit of protectiveness over like what you're doing or your process. And so, but like trying to choose people for this residency and choose researchers who feel a little bit more open, and maybe there's like a framework that helps make them feel safe, that they can share, and that, that's going to be a fruitful thing rather than like a detrimental thing. So yeah, I think Bell Labs is a great example of that. And maybe if you wanted to create a situation where there's artists and scientists working alongside each other, that would be an interesting framework to look at. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.